Hello everybody and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture we're going to continue on with our discussion on the Vietnam War. Now, in our last lecture we sort of got to like the crux, the meat and potatoes of what Vietnam meant as it was unfolding. The instability of the removal of Diem from power, Vietnamese resistance to all of the intimidation factor or intimidation moves orchestrated by the Johnson administration, the all-out bombing campaign. They all sort of led to this sort of global scene, this sort of global picture being painted, in which the United States came off as increasingly it came off increasingly as a power that was incapable of leading the global campaign against communism, and it also came across as a power that was increasingly hostile to the recently freed peoples around the world, to all of the people living in former colonies. It was becoming apparent that the United States was a supporter of the colonialists, of the colonial regimes, and would engage in any sort of destructive war to reinforce the old colonial power, global power sort of ranking, to where recently freed peoples would be free, but they would not have the same sort of national standing or equality as had the Europe had the former colonial powers had. Um, it was a major public relations nightmare for the United States in the early 1970s, late 1960s. Um, Now, this view and the sharp criticisms lobbed at the United States raised the prestige of the Soviet Union. The war had the effect of destroying the presidency of Lyndon Johnson, who decided to retire from politics amid the strain of defending his policies, both his domestic and his foreign policies. They were both heavily criticized. Richard Nixon, he realized the failure of Johnson's direction of the war, and the danger situation of American appeal globally. Nixon, like his predecessors, and really for the same reasons, would not accept defeat in Vietnam. Nobody could accept defeat in Vietnam. Nixon turned to a new strategy, one that he called Vietnamization, which called for the de-escalation of the American presence in South Vietnam and a renewed air campaign against North Vietnam. Now, to force the communist leadership to accept American conditions at the Paris peace talks. Now, Nixon also believed that with detente, the cooling of relations with the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union would in turn lessen its support for North Vietnam. Nixon's plan failed as badly as its predecessors. It was just as bad as Johnson's plan. For one, Nixon did not obtain the Paris Peace Accords. During the Paris Peace Accords, he did bargain for and receive the return of prisoners of war. He did get an armistice with the North, with the government in North Vietnam, and he did get some time to allow the United States to both remove the last combat units from Vietnam, and also a bit of breathing space to sort of build up South Vietnam. But he did not get what he really wanted, and that was a decrease in the pressure from the communists on South Vietnam. North Vietnam, the leaders there were just as politically savvy as Dick Nixon and his advisors. They used the Sino-Soviet break as much as the United States to play both sides off one another. The United States was double dealing with China and the Soviet Union after their very public break. And North Vietnamese, they did the exact same thing. They double dealed with those two powers, and they doubled the amount of foreign aid they received. The the society of the Vietnamese of the Vietnamese the communist society there also refused to extend also refused to accept any sort of weakening and aid they were going to expect from the Soviet Union because of the detente. And in a move of reciprocity, the Soviet Union also refused to extend the detente or the lessening of hostilities to the Vietnam affair. The South Vietnamese government was, has stated before, weak, corrupt, alienated from the people, and totally dependent on foreign aid. As soon as the ink was dried, the South Vietnamese government collapsed almost overnight. So did the Nixon administration by this time. By this time, the Nixon administration was, this is 1973 we're at now, but we're looking at. By this time, that administration, that government was really falling victim to strain, and this strain was caused by the Watergate scandal, which implicated the president in a political espionage plot, and of course the cover up of that espionage plot. Now, the Nixon collapse and the war do not appear related, but they really are interrelated. They, on the surface, they appear to be two separate things, but they one heavily influenced the other. Now, the Watergate break-in and the ensuing cover-up of activities were orchestrated by President Nixon and his supporters, an organization known as CREEP, CRP. And CREEP is how it's pronounced. CRP is the acronym for Committee to Re-elect the President. Former, say, CIA operatives and a number a number of smaller groups. The most well-known would be a group known as the Plumbers. The Plumbers. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. Never happened before. Didn't even realize the phone was on. A group, the group known as the Plumbers, and they were called the Plumbers because they were a group put together to sort of find and solve leaks in the president's administration. A number of influential leaks, information being leaked out to reporters, had come out from the Nixon administration regarding his domestic and foreign policies. And this group was put into place to find out who was releasing information and who and how much information they were actually releasing to the public at large. Now, these groups all came together to participate in the break-in. Nixon used these groups, CREEP and the Plumbers, to search for incriminating evidence against his opponents using a legal operation, but also to find out who was releasing information about his administration to his opponents and to the press. Now, Nixon targeted the Watergate complex to find information he could use to undermine his Democratic opponents and shore up support for his own foreign policy. There are far more factors that come into play than I listed, and we'll get into those factors a little later when we discuss Nixon's administration. Now there are far more factors for while the United States policy in Vietnam failed. To throw another factor in there, to go back to Lyndon Johnson, his bombing campaign was compromised by a lack of target sites. If you're going to drop bombs, if you're going to use air campaigns, you need verified target sites. You need multiple target sites. If you're only going to bomb 4 places, well, then everyone is just going to avoid those 4 places. You need a varied list of target sites, and on top of that, as I stated earlier, it did not intimidate the Vietnamese people. It did not frighten them. Air campaigns rarely succeed, and when they do succeed, they're successful in combination with ground support or naval support. Many people sort of look at the atomic bombs being dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki as definitive proof that an air campaign would be successful. In reality, it wasn't so much the bombings themselves, but the fact that nobody knew how much bombs the Americans had, uh, and the prospect of simply dropping bombs on all these major population centers and simply wiping out the population in order to simply move in and reorganize the nation. When we contrast Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the uncertainty of whether there were more atomic bombs with the Blitz, the Luftwaffe Blitzkrieg of London and Coventry and other selected sites in southern England, along with the bombing campaigns in Dresden and Hamburg during World War II. They failed spectacularly to motivate the people that were being bombed to surrender to their bombers, to their attackers. So Johnson's bombing campaign failed. Not enough target sites did not frighten the people. The campaign was also conducted on the very questionable logic that only using those bombing campaigns would induce people to surrender. The later search and destroy strategy was largely ineffective and resulted in widespread civilian casualties, undermining the reputation of the United States in Vietnam. The lack of a clear long-term strategy other than containing communism has also been pointed out as the reason for the failure in Vietnam. The major or main reason for the failure of the war lay in viewing Vietnam solely in Cold War terms rather than in anti-colonial or nationalistic terms. Along with this went a related ignorance of Vietnamese history and culture, points that I alluded to earlier. The ignorance was at a partially, was really the ignorance within American policy advisors was partially a result of the Cold War itself. During the McCarthy era in the 1950s, most of the Southeastern Asian experts had been purged from the State Department for their policies and their prophecies regarding China. Since the United States only viewed Vietnam through the lens of its overarching global strategy to contain communism, they could not effectively make any sort of attempt to focus squarely on Vietnam or to address the needs of the Vietnamese. There could be both lasting and there could have been a lasting and a meaningful plan to resolve the conflict favorably, but the intentions were so narrowed, so construed that it never would have dawned on anyone. It never would have gained much traction anywhere to be put into effect. Now, every administration was hamstrung by these factors. They could only manage. They could only manage the situation and look to avoid defeat during its watch. Moreover, Hanoi's ability to field large armies of its own and its ability to sustain multiple armies in the field meant that the Johnson buildup of 500,000 troops was not enough to secure victory. It was not enough to secure a victory. A sum somewhere into the millions would really have been necessary to defend South Vietnam, the American supply line, friendly settlements, and of course to launch the attacks into North Vietnam to begin the process of taking and holding regions to finally quash the threat of communism. And that force would have had to remain there well into the next decade to ensure that there was not a backtrap, a backsliding in North Vietnam, and they would also have to continue on with long-term overseas aid and development to try to get the Vietnamese government on sound enough footing to where they will be able to look after their own needs. Now, presidential administrations and their motivations. it would have been completely impossible to achieve that, to build up those forces and make that sort of commitment, given the global commitment the United States had and the incredibly fierce opposition to the draft in the United States. Moreover, the troops that fought in Vietnam would have been needed, had I stayed there for more than a decade, to garrison that region to ensure stability. The decision by each administration to do only what was necessary to ensure that defeat did not occur on its watch was motivated by domestic factors, most notably a desire to not be labeled soft on communist or having lost the Indochine. Tellingly, the failure in Vietnam had far more negative domestic consequences than internationally. And contrary to Eisenhower's domino theory, the fall of Vietnam, the fall of Saigon, did not lead to the communization of all East Asia. Moreover, there was no sense of communist unity. The old dislikes that predated communism or imperialism flared up as the new nations all went to war with each other in rapid succession. In fact, when we look at the after effects of Vietnam, it's a reverse domino theory, in that Vietnam invaded Cambodia shortly after the United States removed itself from Vietnam, shortly after North Vietnam invaded the South and reunified the entire country. The newly unified Vietnam invaded Cambodia. This Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia was followed by China's invasion of Vietnam, and the Soviet Union and China very nearly coming to blows over that invasion. The failure in Vietnam did not reshape global balance of power between the United States and the Soviet Union. Domestically, as I stated earlier, Vietnam ripped the republic apart. It destroyed the Johnson administration, and to an extent, the Nixon administration ended up having to end this bipartisan consensus in foreign policy that had been in place since the end of World War II, since the beginning of the Cold War. Something that had been in play for nearly 30 years was ended overnight by Dick Nixon over Vietnam. It also led many Americans, particularly young Americans, to question the actions and the motivations of their government, the truthfulness of their government. Many of these Americans who had their faith shattered in the government never regained that faith in the government or in the republic in general. These negative consequences will come to serve a very real and lasting part of the Vietnam legacy. Now, another legacy of Vietnam, as we wrapped our discussion up, another legacy is that most Americans, for most Americans, the Vietnam War is an affair to forget, an inconsequential embarrassment to never be brought up, and to others, it is a benchmark by which current and future military operations can and need to be measured. The problem with such a view, especially using Vietnam as a benchmark for a comparison to any event, particularly any military event, is that to do so, you must single out events and present them as stand-alone events. And if you do that, the context of history is narrowed so that in order to confirm would already be a pre-held notion you have of a contemporary or past event, you must ignore the evidence that points to a contradictory conclusion. And that is to say that you can say that you put enough troops on the ground, you can still be defeated. You can look at the Tet Offensive and see that, but if you don't take the full measure of it into the fact that there's just been this buildup, but that the United States really wasn't using that buildup to its full potential. If you look at it and you say that, well, even in the aftermath of the Tet Offensive, that buildup of troops was enough to repel and drive out root and stem the North Vietnamese sort of like proxy zones or friendly zones, friendly stations in South Vietnam. They were rooted out and destroyed in the aftermath of the Tet Offensive, and that the Tet Offensive did not result in the destruction of the American fighting army in Vietnam, nor did it result in the wounding of any sort of irreparable damage being inflicted upon the United States Army in Vietnam. I sort of feel like I'm rambling right now, so I'm just going to cut this. As always, hit like, subscribe, and comment. And we will continue on with our discussion of United States history. And I'm Ted, and I'll see you guys next time for another lecture.